You can't sit together. This is not a nursing home. It's an airline. The flight attendant snapped. What she didn't know. The elderly couple she just humiliated were the founders of the airline she worked for. The Los Angeles International Airport buzzed with its usual chaos. Announcements echoing from loudspeakers, luggage wheels clattering, and families weaving through crowds with wide eyes and weary feet. Amid it all, George Carter, 82, gently guided his wife Evelyn, 79, toward Terminal 3. They moved slowly but gracefully, dressed in matching beige sweaters. Evelyn held a small photograph framed tightly, an image of their wedding day, 60 years ago, at a modest church in Alabama. The photo had yellowed around the edges, but the love in it remained fresh. They were traveling to New York for their 60th anniversary celebration with their children and grandchildren. George had planned it for months, choosing the same airline they once helped launch with their life savings. Liberty Wings. That as they approached the check-in counter, a young attendant smiled warmly. "Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Carter. We've received your request to sit together. Let me confirm, seats 17A and 17B, side by side." Evelyn beamed. "Perfect. Thank you, sweetheart." George squeezed her hand. 60 years, and I've never sat on a flight without her beside me. Not starting now. They made their way slowly toward the gate. Meanwhile, inside the aircraft, Flight 219 to JFK was nearly ready to board. Assigned to supervise the boarding process that day was Ashley Green, 25, a recently promoted flight attendant. She was sharp, ambitious, and known for following protocols to the letter. Her colleagues often joked that Ashley would rather lose a passenger than bend a rule. She had no idea who George and Evelyn were. Moments later, as the couple boarded the plane, George looked at his boarding pass and frowned. "Seat 17A, he read, then glanced at Evelyn's, 19C. His heart sank. "Evie, something's wrong. You're not next to me." They looked around. Seat 17B was already occupied by a man in a tailored suit, tapping furiously on his laptop. "Excuse me," George said politely. "I think my wife is supposed to be seated here." The man barely looked up. "Nope. I paid extra for this seat. I'm not moving." George turned to Evelyn, confused, then flagged down a passing attendant. It was Ashley. "Yes," she said, voice clipped. "We were assigned to sit together. But our seats are apart now. Is there a mistake?" Ashley took their tickets and checked the manifest. It looks like your wife has been moved to 19C. Probably a system adjustment. The gentleman in 17B upgraded last minute. Nothing I can do." George blinked. "Can you ask him to switch with my wife? We're celebrating our 60th anniversary. We've never flown apart." Ashley gave a tight smile. "Sir, this is not a sentimental service. This is an airline. Seats are assigned based on bookings and upgrades. She'll be fine in 19C. Evelyn's face fell. She whispered, "I'm okay, George. It's just a few rows." But George didn't budge. "Please, we're not asking for a handout. Just a seat together. I'll switch. Anything." Ashley's smile disappeared. "Look, if we made exceptions for every emotional plea, we'd have chaos. You'll need to take your assigned seats." Her voice had risen just enough for other passengers to notice. A few looked over. Evelyn's cheeks flushed as she shuffled down the aisle alone. George sat in 17A, his heart heavy, staring at the back of her silver hair, 3 rows away, in the first-class cabin. Someone else had noticed everything. A woman with silver blonde hair and a navy blue power suit set down her tablet. She had been watching silently since the couple boarded. Margaret Collins, 52, CEO of Liberty Wings, was used to traveling anonymously to observe the experience firsthand. She rarely revealed her identity on flights, preferring to sit and see how her crews performed under pressure. But this was different. She recognized George and Evelyn instantly. They weren't just loyal customers. They were the co-founders of Liberty Wings. 40 years ago, the Carters mortgaged their home to help launch the company in a tiny office near Atlanta. And now, one of her flight attendants had told them, "This is not a sentimental service." Margaret stood up quietly. The plane hadn't taken off yet. She pressed the service button. Back in row 17, George leaned toward the aisle, straining to catch a glimpse of Evelyn. She hadn't turned around once. Probably didn't want him to see her wiping away tears. Ashley walked past him without a glance. Passengers whispered, "That couple just wanted to sit together. Poor thing. He looks heartbroken." Why didn't the guy in 17B just switch? Tension simmered quietly across the cabin, and then footsteps. High heels. Firm. Intentional. Margaret Collins stepped into the economy section. She stopped in front of Ashley, who looked up, startled. "Ma'am, can I help you?" Ashley asked, confused. Margaret didn't smile. "You already did enough." Ashley blinked in disbelief. The woman standing in front of her didn't look like a passenger coming to complain. She had authority in her posture, weight in her gaze, and her silence carried more tension than raised voices ever could. "Ma'am?" Ashley repeated. "Is there a problem?" Margaret Collins took a slow breath. "Yes, a very big one." Ashley straightened. "Okay, let's speak in private. Can I help you with your seat?" "No," Margaret replied sharply. "You can help me by answering a question. Why did you just separate an elderly couple who requested to sit together?" Ashley glanced around, uncomfortable. It wasn't personal. One of the seats was upgraded by another passenger, and we followed the manifest. "I can't undo that." Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper that carried like thunder. "You could have asked someone to switch. Or you could have exercised an ounce of human decency. But you didn't. You chose protocol over compassion." Ashley's jaw tightened. "We're trained to avoid unnecessary disruptions." "You are trained," Margaret replied firmly, "to serve people, not systems." Other flight attendants nearby looked over, sensing something unusual. A murmur spread through the front cabin. The man in the suit sitting in 17B began shifting in his seat uncomfortably. Back in row 19, Evelyn sat alone, fingers clenched together on her lap. Her eyes stared blankly at the tray table. Every few seconds, she peeked toward row 17, where George sat half-turned in his seat, straining to catch a glimpse of her. Passengers whispered to one another. A young woman across the aisle took out her phone and began discreetly recording "in first class." The co-pilot glanced back through the curtain. "Is something going on out there?" he asked the flight attendant near the cockpit. The answer was yes, something big. Margaret turned to Ashley and said, "Bring the couple up." "Now." Ashley hesitated. "Excuse me, who exactly are you two?" That's when she saw it. Pinned just below Margaret's lapel was a small gold pin. The Liberty Wings insignia, but this one was different. A crest, encircled in platinum. The executive mark of the airline's board of directors. Ashley's face drained of color. Margaret extended her hand. "Margaret Collins, CEO of Liberty Wings. And those two people you just treated like burdens? They're the reason this airline exists." Ashley froze. "The Carters invested in us when we were a garage operation in Atlanta. George built our first training manual. Evelyn handled operations for our first 12 pilots. They are not passengers. They are our legacy." For a moment, the world stopped. Margaret didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply turned around and walked toward economy. Row 17, that George Carter looked up as he saw her coming down the aisle. His eyes widened, not in fear, but recognition. "Margaret," he said, almost not believing it. She smiled gently. "Hello, George. Sorry for the delay." He stood up, wobbling slightly. "What are you doing here?" "Fixing a mistake," she said. She turned to Evelyn in row 19. "Mrs. Carter, may I escort you and your husband to first class?" The cabin fell silent. Evelyn looked stunned. "But we didn't book." "I'm not offering a seat. I'm offering respect," Margaret said warmly. Passengers began clapping. A few stood. The man in 17B sheepishly slid out of his seat, avoiding eye contact. Ashley, now standing like a ghost near the galley, looked as if the floor might swallow her. Margaret led the Carters gently forward. As they passed each row, passengers smiled, nodded, even teared up. Someone whispered, "60 years together." Another voice said, "Damn right they deserve first class." A young flight attendant quickly adjusted pillows in the front cabin as Margaret helped Evelyn into her seat. George sat beside her. His hand found hers instinctively. "Thank you," Evelyn whispered to Margaret. Margaret knelt slightly. "I should be thanking you. This company is what it is because of the values you taught us. Compassion, grace, and dignity." She stood, looked at Ashley, and said flatly, "We'll talk when we land." Then turned to the intercom and said, loud and clear, "Ladies and gentlemen, Liberty Wings would like to honor two very special passengers today, George and Evelyn Carter, whose love helped build this airline. Let us all remember, behind every policy is a human being. Applause thundered through the cabin. And for the first time that day, Evelyn smiled without holding back. The cabin hadn't fully recovered from the announcement. Passengers were still talking in hushed tones. Some were texting friends. Others were scrolling through social media, stunned to already find videos of the scene circulating. Clips of the CEO personally walking George and Evelyn to first class. Margaret Collins had returned to her seat, but kept her gaze locked on the aisle. Her presence, calm but commanding, seemed to reset the energy on the plane. Ashley stood frozen near the rear galley. Her face was pale, her thoughts racing. How could she have been so blind? She thought back to every moment she had dismissed the couple, the request, the pleading, the emotion in Evelyn's voice. She had reduced it all to a policy issue. Meanwhile, up front, Evelyn leaned back in the wide leather seat of first class, a warm towel draped over her hands. George looked over at her, eyes soft. "Comfortable?" he asked. Evelyn smiled faintly. "It's not the seat, George. It's being beside you." He chuckled. "Well, I would have sat in the baggage compartment as long as I was next to you." The couple held hands, surrounded now not by cold protocol, but by warmth. A flight attendant, one who had watched the incident quietly, came over with 2 glasses of sparkling water. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," she said gently. "On behalf of the rest of us, I just want to say thank you for everything. We had no idea." George responded humbly. "We never wanted recognition. We just wanted to build something that treated people right." In the crew quarters, Ashley sat down, trembling. The assistant purser, James, approached cautiously. "You okay?" She stared at her hands. "No, I was wrong." James didn't say anything for a moment. Then quietly, "You were harsh. But we've all had moments where the manual spoke louder than our hearts." Ashley nodded. "Yeah, but I humiliated them. I forgot they were people. I forgot. Service means seeing the person in front of you, not just the seat assignment." She looked up, eyes rimmed red. "Am I going to be fired?" James didn't answer. Instead, he said, "Margaret's not like other execs. She doesn't fire for mistakes. She fires for arrogance." Ashley swallowed hard. "I wasn't arrogant. I was blind." "Then maybe you've got a chance," he said. "But you need to make it right." At 35,000 feet, news traveled fast. The clip of Margaret's mid-flight intervention had reached Twitter, TikTok, and even LinkedIn. The hashtags #George and Evelyn and #LibertyWingsLove were trending within 30 minutes of takeoff. Commenters from around the world chimed in. "This is what leadership looks like." That couple built a legacy, and the airline almost disrespected it out of existence. "I'm switching all my flights to Liberty Wings." In the cockpit, the pilot received a message from air control. "You've gone viral midair. Tell Margaret. And tell the Carters thank you." Toward the end of the flight, Ashley gathered herself. Her uniform was crisp, but her shoulders slouched in apology. She walked to first class. A few passengers noticed, watching with curiosity. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," she said softly. George and Evelyn looked up. "I owe you a deep, personal apology," Ashley continued. "I failed to see the humans behind the boarding passes. I saw your age. I saw inconvenience. And I didn't see your love, your history, your kindness." Her voice cracked. "I can't undo what I said. But I want you to know, I've learned more in one flight than in all my training." There was silence. Then Evelyn reached out her hand. Ashley looked at it, stunned. Evelyn smiled. "We all make mistakes. But only the brave apologize." George nodded. "Just remember this. The heart of service isn't protocol. It's people." Ashley bowed slightly, tears in her eyes, then walked back. The cabin seemed to breathe again. The plane descended smoothly toward JFK, the Manhattan skyline glowing in the distance through the oval windows. Most passengers were still riding the emotional high from what had transpired during the flight. George and Evelyn Carter, now resting peacefully in their first-class seats, held hands and looked out the window, not at the city, but at each other. 60 years ago, George whispered, "We took a train to New York. Now we're flying first class, on an airline we helped build." Evelyn smiled. "Life has a way of coming full circle." The captain's voice came through the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. On behalf of Liberty Wings, thank you for flying with us. And a special thanks again to Mr. and Mrs. Carter, our heroes on the ground and in the skies." Applause broke out again, spontaneous, sincere, and loud. Meanwhile, in the crew galley, Ashley stood beside the door, adjusting her collar and breathing slowly. She had recovered from the earlier breakdown but hadn't stopped thinking since. She had felt shame, then regret, and now clarity, that a lesson she would never forget. When you're trusted to serve people, you're trusted to see them. As the wheels touched down and the plane taxied toward the gate, the terminal outside was already buzzing. Word had traveled faster than the aircraft itself. Dozens of journalists, bloggers, and curious citizens waited just beyond the glass with cameras ready. Inside, the crew prepared for disembarkation. Margaret approached the Carters with a warm smile. "We'd be honored if you'd allow us to escort you off the plane first," she said. George laughed. "That's a first. Usually we let everyone else go ahead." Margaret shook her head. "Not this time." The cabin doors opened. Margaret led the way, followed by George and Evelyn, with Ashley a respectful few steps behind. As they stepped into the jet bridge, cheers erupted from the other side of the glass. People held up signs. "Thank you, Carters. Love, policy, built on compassion." Flashbulbs flickered. A Liberty Wings spokesperson waited with a microphone. "George and Evelyn Carter," he said proudly into a broadcast mic. "We welcome you home, not just as passengers, but as founders, family, and an inspiration to every person in the sky." The media swarmed. Reporters asked questions. "What went through your mind when you were told you couldn't sit together? How does it feel to watch your legacy come alive today? Do you think the airline has changed since you started it?" George's answer was simple. "Airlines have planes, but what makes them fly is people. Never forget that." Evelyn added, "We just wanted to love each other and be seen. That's all any human being wants." Margaret stood beside them, a hand over her heart. "That's the future we're flying toward." Back inside the terminal, Ashley stood near a window, watching it all unfold. She wasn't hiding, just observing. A teenage girl beside her turned and said, "Were you the flight attendant?" Ashley hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, I was." The girl smiled. "You're brave. Not many people apologize. My mom says it takes guts to grow." Ashley blinked. "Your mom sounds wise." "She is. She's a therapist." The girl grinned. Ashley chuckled. "Makes sense." The girl handed her a small notepad and said, "Write that down." Ashley took the pad and began to write. "Service isn't about policies. It's about people. And people remember how you made them feel." She tore off the note and tucked it into her badge holder. 3 days after the Carters' flight, Liberty Wings headquarters held an emergency board meeting. Not because of scandal, but because of the overwhelming public response. The company's social media had exploded. Over 8 million views on TikTok, 120,000 retweets, trending hashtags in over 15 countries. But this wasn't just viral. It was transformational. Margaret Collins sat at the head of the conference table, a large monitor behind her displaying a paused clip of George and Evelyn walking through the terminal hand in hand, surrounded by cheering passengers. "We all saw the video," Margaret began. "And we all saw ourselves in that flight attendant, overwhelmed, rushed, focused on rules. But more importantly, we saw what Liberty Wings is supposed to be." A board member nodded. "Dignity, humanity, grace." Another added, "And second chances." Back at their modest home in Montgomery, Alabama, George was in the garden pruning rose bushes. Evelyn sat on the porch swing, flipping through a scrapbook filled with clippings from newspapers across the country. Elderly couple reunited on flight. Inspires new standard for airline compassion. Liberty Wings TO introduce Carter class for elderly passengers. She chuckled softly. "They're calling us airline celebrities now." George laughed from the yard. "Only took us 60 years. Just then, the doorbell rang. A delivery man handed over a large white envelope marked "Confidential," hand-delivered. Inside was a letter from Liberty Wings. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Carter, on behalf of every team member at Liberty Wings, we would like to offer our most heartfelt thanks, not only for founding this airline, but for reminding us of our purpose. Starting next quarter, we are officially introducing Blue Square the Carter Code, a mandatory empathy-based training program for all flight staff. Blue Square Carter Companion Seating. Guaranteed seating together for elderly couples and caregivers at no extra charge. Blue Square the Carter Compassion Award, an annual honor given to employees who exemplify kindness above protocol. Your love inspired all of this, and it will keep inspiring generations to come. With all our gratitude, Margaret Collinso, Liberty Wings. Evelyn's hands trembled as she passed the letter to George. He read it quietly, eyes moist. They named it after us, he said softly. Meanwhile, Ashley, still a flight attendant, now stood before a classroom of new hires at the Liberty Wings Training Academy. At a projection screen behind her displayed a single image. George and Evelyn smiling in first class. Before we talk about beverage carts or safety protocols, she said, we're going to talk about humanity. This, she pointed to the photo, is why you're here. A trainee raised her hand. Are you the one who separated them? Ashley nodded. I was, and I was wrong. But the Carters gave me a second chance. That's what this company is now built on. Not perfection, but redemption. She smiled. Let's begin. Months later, Liberty Wings unveiled a new livery design. Painted on the side of their newest aircraft was a soft script. The Carters. Love is the true upgrade. Inside, rows 17A and 17B were permanently labeled with a brass plaque, reserved in honor of George and Evelyn Carter, together always. That same aircraft became the most requested for wedding proposals, vow renewals, and anniversary flights. George and Evelyn were invited as guests of honor at the airline's 50th anniversary gala. Standing at the podium, Evelyn said, when we mortgaged our home to help build this company, we didn't imagine our names would ever be painted on a plane. All we wanted was to stay close, to sit together, to be seen. Now, because of all of you, thousands of couples will be seen too. Thunderous applause. Margaret stepped forward. George, Evelyn, this airline has wings because of you. Tonight, the sky belongs to your love. The story of George and Evelyn Carter was no longer just a moment. It had become a movement. Within weeks, the airline industry took notice. 3 major competitors announced similar programs for elderly and disabled passengers. Training modules in empathy and discretion started appearing in aviation academies across the country. News anchors, influencers, and even late-night comedians referenced the Carter's flight. What surprised everyone, however, was the letters, thousands of them. From across the globe, people of all ages wrote to Liberty Wings. Some shared stories of being separated from loved ones during travel. Others wrote about how seeing George and Evelyn rekindled their hope in humanity. One letter came from a teenager in Detroit. I watched the video with my grandma. She cried. My grandpa passed away last year, and she said she wished someone had stood up for them when they were treated like furniture on flights. Thank you for honoring her pain. Another came from a retired pilot. I flew for 42 years, and I've never been prouder to see love take precedence over policies. Meanwhile, Liberty Wings prepared for a historic event, their first ever legacy flight. The idea was simple but powerful, a chartered flight exclusively for couples married 40 years or more. No fees, no press, just respect. Of course, George and Evelyn were at the top of the guest list. But what they didn't know was that Margaret had something bigger in mind. The gate for Flight LW 1965, named after the Carters' wedding year. A crowd of elderly couples, holding hands, giggling like newlyweds, waited with excitement. Every couple had been flown in, offered hotel stays, and treated like VIPs. When George and Evelyn arrived, the gate attendant handed them golden boarding passes. Embossed in elegant script, welcome aboard the legacy flight in honor of the Carters. Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes. We were just trying to sit next to each other, she whispered. Margaret, standing nearby, responded, you ended up sitting the whole world beside you. On board, the aircraft had been transformed. Photos of George and Evelyn's life journey lined the cabin walls. Romantic music played softly. Each seat had a handwritten note. You are proof that love can fly. When the Carters stepped on board, the entire cabin applauded. A man in his 80s stood up and saluted. His wife whispered, they're the reason we're all here. George smiled humbly. We're all the reason. Midway through the flight, Margaret walked down the aisle with a small box. George, Evelyn, she said, pausing at their seats. On behalf of Liberty Wings and every soul who believes in love, I present to you this. Inside the box was a miniature aircraft model, but it wasn't just any model. It was a custom die-cast replica of the Liberty Wings jet with their names etched under the wings. The Carters, together always, Evelyn gasped. George wiped his glasses, pretending it was just dust. Passengers clapped. Some wept. Others reached for their partners' hands. reminded that real love changes things. Later, Margaret stood at the front of the cabin and made an announcement. We are proud to inform you that Liberty Wings will officially name its new fleet of long-range jets after couples who embody compassion and commitment. The Carters are just the beginning. Cheers filled the air. Someone shouted from row 4. Does that mean I can name one after my wife if I make it to 50 years? The whole cabin laughed. That evening, as the plane descended through golden light toward San Diego, Evelyn leaned over to George and whispered, "Do you realize we changed the sky?" George chuckled. "No, honey. We just reminded it how to shine." Months passed since the legacy flight, but the impact of the Carter's story continued to ripple outward like circles in still water. What began with a refusal to sit together had ignited an industry-wide cultural shift. The term Carter moment was coined, used to describe any instance where empathy triumphed over bureaucracy. It appeared in employee evaluations, leadership training modules, and even TED Talks on service transformation. Liberty Wings wasn't the only company to respond. A wave of new policies began. Heartside seating prioritized adjacent seats for elderly, disabled, or grieving passengers. Legacy lounge. Exclusive quiet spaces in terminals for couples married over 50 years. The Carter Pledge, signed by 60-plus airlines, pledging dignity-driven service. But the Carters, they stayed quiet. George and Evelyn declined nearly every talk show invitation, media appearance, and sponsorship request. Not out of protest, but humility. "We didn't do this for fame," George told a local reporter. "We just wanted to sit together. That's all." But Liberty Wings had one last surprise. Something so big it was planned in secret over 6 months that on a bright Saturday morning, George and Evelyn were invited to the airline's new training campus in Atlanta. They were told they'd be observing a new class of trainees. Instead, they were led to a courtyard filled with over 400 employees. On stage stood Margaret Collins, holding a covered plaque. She greeted them warmly. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter, today we're not honoring the past. We're anchoring the future." She pulled back the cloth. Etched into stone was a life-size bronze sculpture. George and Evelyn seated side by side, holding hands, mid-laughter. Below it, engraved in elegant lettering, "In a world divided by walls, they built an airline with a seat for love." Evelyn gasped. George froze. The audience stood in silence, many with tears. Margaret continued, "From this day forward, every Liberty Wings employee will walk past this statue before their first flight, to remember that service starts not with uniform, but with heart." Later that afternoon, George sat alone near the sculpture, watching employees line up to take photos. He noticed a young flight attendant standing off to the side. "Ashley," she slowly approached. "Mr. Carter," she began, "I never had the chance to properly thank you for what you gave me, for what you gave all of us." George smiled warmly. "You're still flying?" She nodded. "I am. But now, I'm leading training. We teach the Carter way on day 1. He chuckled. "What's that?" Ashley grinned. "It's simple. Rule number 1. Ask how they're feeling before asking for their ticket." He laughed. "That'll fly." They sat quietly, side by side, as the sun lowered behind the hangars. That evening, George and Evelyn boarded one final flight. Not commercial, but private. Liberty Wings had prepared a surprise round trip for just the two of them as the jet ascended through pink clouds. Evelyn leaned her head on George's shoulder. "We changed the world," she whispered. George kissed her temple. "We just reminded it what love looks like." The lights dimmed. The engines hummed. The sky, vast and open, held them both gently, together, exactly where they always belonged.